Good evening. This is the regularly scheduled meeting of the Historical Society of Frankfurt. We do this 8 times a year, September through December and March through June, as a program meeting. And we encourage anybody who's watching tonight that hasn't been experienced with us before to check our website and come back and see us some more in the future. We hope to have a somewhat larger remote audience tonight than usual because we are thrilled to be included in Archives Month, which is an organization of Pennsylvania library, special collections archivists who get together in October, every year in October being Archives Month, to put on as special a program that will have as big a reach as they can, and they indulge us. We don't have a professional archivist, but we have crack volunteers that attempt to do as well as the professionals, and I think quite often do. And so we get indulged by being included on the schedule for that, and we're hoping we're reaching some folks tonight that we wouldn't ordinarily. Our talk is on Pennsylvania before Penn, meaning the particular stretch of time that the Swedes were dominant here where we are. And Reverend Kim Eric Williams is going to talk about that. He's the historian of the Swedish Colonial Society. They have a museum, which you may want to mention, which is well worth seeing. I got to attend the dedication of that not very long ago. It's quite an interesting place. And they also they're the descendants. The organization is primarily the descendants of the Swedish colonial occupants. So Reverend Williams is quite the expert on all the details of that period of time, among his many other accomplishments. And we're looking forward to that. I wanted to do this particular program for Archives Month because I think it has a lot of bearing on the current national discussion, which has a lot, is political basically, but it's also based in part on the historical facts of what America is all about and who our immigrants have been. And I think there's a lot in Reverend Williams's talk that bears significantly on that discussion and maybe can help to create a little more understanding between the sides. So with that, I give you Reverend Kim Eric Williams.
Well, thank you very much. It's fun to be here. I see Swedish things. I see a beautiful framed object over here with one of my ancestors' signatures on it from 1687. John Stilley, he was an uncle of mine way back when. And of course, the flag of Philadelphia is the Swedish colors. So there's all sorts of little secrets about New Sweden that are hanging around in Philadelphia that most people don't know about, including the fact that there was something here before Penn. Most people think that it was wilderness before Penn, but it wasn't, in fact. And if you'd asked someone in Europe about it, they would have said, well, that's Virginia, because they considered Virginia everything from the James River up to the Hudson. They just skipped over it. It was just Virginia. But in 1638, the Swedes came and established an amazing but short-lived culture in the Delaware Valley. But they had a governor, they had a court, they had an educational system, they had churches, and they had divided the area up into forts and ways by which they could trade with the native Lenape. So it's an interesting story, but an odd story, really, when you think about it, because why should Sweden even want a colony? Such a little country in Northern Europe, a country that nobody ever walked across because it was too far north. Well, there was a new France, there was a new Spain, there was a new England, and so Sweden began to think, well, with our 2 million people spread over what today is Finland and Sweden, maybe we could really have a colony too. Of course, the Spaniards and the Portuguese were making a fortune from the colonies which they had, and particularly the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is very important for the story of New Sweden, because without the Netherlands, New Sweden would not have existed. And it's worth reading about its history and the way it was fighting with Spain and the Holy Roman Empire for 60 years until it finally was independent as the United Provinces of the Netherlands. The whole northern part, the southern part stayed with the Holy Roman Empire. And even today, you see that difference in Belgium and in the Netherlands. So there was a lot of things that came together for the Netherlands. One was that they became independent. Another one was that a lot of people began to immigrate to Amsterdam. In 1492, of course, we know what happened. But what we forget in 1492 also was Spain got rid of its Arabs and its Jews, threw them out. Either you would become a Roman Catholic or say you were a Roman Catholic, at least make a pretense of it, or we would round you up, and that was the end of your career. A lot of people went to the Netherlands because the Netherlands was Dutch Reformed. They were welcoming people of all different religions. A lot of Jews, a lot of diamond merchants came into Amsterdam during that time. There was a whole kind of renaissance. And all we have to do is think about the great painters in the Netherlands at that time to know what was going on there. But they invented ships. They invented the type of ships that nobody had ever seen before, because they could sail from the Netherlands down past Africa and around to the Far East and be loaded up with staples and come back and make a fabulous fortune. So the Netherlands got to be, in fact, a very rich, small country. And one of the secrets was the trading company. That was an invention that came along in the early 1600s. And it was an invention that was made by entrepreneurs and people who wanted to invest in something that would have a good return, but also it was quite an advantage for the governments, because rather than the King of England having to get money to send people to Jamestown, you have the Virginia Company, and they raised their own money, and they found Jamestown, which of course was more or less a disaster with 200 people dying the first year. But it wasn't the government's fault. It was the Virginia Company's fault. In the Netherlands, you had the Dutch East India Company, which made a fortune. They brought back spices, they brought back silks, they brought back porcelains, and people began to see that. Even someone like Peter the Great of Russia, the Tsar, came over just to study how this economic miracle was working in the Netherlands. How could they have trading companies how was it organized? How did it go? And it was really the Dutch who gave the idea to the Swedes that you ought to have a colony. And it goes back to us remembering the foundation of New York City, which was, of course, New Amsterdam. It was the Dutch colony here. And if you might remember the name of Peter Minuit, who was the first governor of New Netherlands. And he's the one who came over and suggested that, I don't think that the capital of your colony should be on Burlington Island on the Delaware. It probably is not a good idea. It should be on Manhattan. And then we've seen all this fake story, about Peter Minuit buying Manhattan for $24, from the Indians, which of course is all faked. It was not $24, and he wasn't buying because the Indians did not sell land. They had no idea of land being worth money or to be sold. For the Native Americans, land was like air. It was something that you share with everyone. So they believed when they got a chest full of goodies from the Dutch that, oh, these people are so nice. They're great. They're going to be here with us. We'll be able to trade with them. And every so often they'll give us more things, sort of like a condo. You just have to keep paying from time to time. They didn't understand they were being hoodwinked and everything was being stolen from them. Anyway, Peter Minuit got into some problems soon after the establishment of New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island. And because of that, he lost his job. And a lot had to do with the patroon system. I don't want to go into this right now, but we can talk a little bit more about it. One of the ideas of the trading company originally was it wasn't a colony. You didn't bring people over there and have streets and governments and all that. A trading company was only to make a trading post. You have as few people as possible, as few people that you have to pay wages to. You get as much raw material from the country and get it out of there and make the money. So the argument was for the Dutch, shall we do this or shall we have the patroon system? And the patroon system said that certain investors in Holland would get a large piece of property which they could develop and they could sell to farmers. And so there would be then agricultural products for the people who were there. Anyway, he's got on the wrong side of that argument. And so he and some of the Swedish merchants in Amsterdam decided, well, if the Dutch West India Company is so stupid and they don't know what they're doing, maybe we should find somebody else. So they went and visited Axel Oxenstierna. He was the Chancellor of Sweden. The king was away fighting. And sadly, Gustavus Adolphus did die on the battlefield soon after. But anyway, the proposal was made to them, why don't you support us with a joint venture? It'll be half Swedish, it'll be half Dutch. And our friend, Peter Minuit, knows everything about America. Remember, America was not known. I mean, you didn't have a map at the corner bookstore to find out where America was. These things were state secrets. But Peter Minuit had been up the Delaware River. He'd been up the Christina, the Minquis River. He'd been at the Chesapeake. He knew the whole territory. And he realized that between Virginia and the Dutch on Manhattan, there was an area that no one was really going to take charge of. And you could put a colony there and you'd get away with it. So they decided that that would work. Axel Oxenstierna was looking for money. They were involved in the 30 Years' War. Eventually, they did very well with the 30 Years' War, but they didn't have enough soldiers. They were killing all their own soldiers, and they had to get the Scots and the English and everybody else to help them in their battles. That meant they had to be paid. And you could only get so much taxes out of people. So they were looking to make a profit somehow, and they hoped that this would do it. So Peter Minuit then was able to assemble everything that they might need. Sweden did not even have any ship that had ever crossed the Atlantic Ocean, nor did they have sailors or captains who knew about the Atlantic Ocean. They were so poorly developed at that point that all of the stores for the ships which left Gothenburg in Sweden, they had to come from the Netherlands and be loaded in Sweden. Sweden couldn't even make its own bricks. So everything had to come from the Netherlands, which they needed for the trip. So the first picture there shows you the Kalmar nickel. It was, of course, made in the Netherlands. It's one of those fancy ships that was so able to travel such long distances. And it went over with another ship, the Fogle Grip. We don't have a picture of that. But some of you who've been to Wilmington maybe have seen the replica of the Kalmar nickel, which is docked there on the 7th Street Peninsula. And they have a maritime center now, so that even when the boat is not docked, you can go to the maritime center and learn a little bit more about sailing in the 17th century and how that was. Well, the two ships are finally loaded in Gothenburg, and they get over and come up the Delaware Bay, and they go in the Minquas Kill, which today we call the Christina River. Now, this is interesting that it wasn't like Penn, who wanted a great place for Philadelphia where he could control everything. Instead, Peter Minuit said, no, we're going to go 2 miles inland, and there will be the fort and the trading post. It will be called Fort Christina, 2 miles inland from the Delaware. It was a very smart move because the Dutch already had a fort on the Delaware River right across from Philadelphia, Fort Nassau. And Peter Minuit knew about that. He helped build it, in fact, when he was the governor of New Netherlands. So he didn't want the Dutch to know right away that they were there. He wanted to get the building up, get the thing moving before the Dutch found out about it. He also knew that they had a very weak governor and not much military. He would be able to get away with it. So the Kalmar nickel docks there. They take the ship's boat and go up the Minquas Kill, which they renamed Christina River. It was called Minquas Kill after the Indians who lived around the Susquehanna, because they came down that river with their furs, which was the other reason to make the first settlement at what is today Wilmington, that the Swedes and the Finns there would get the furs from the Indians before they got over to New Jersey, where the Dutch were. So they took the little ship's boat up, and they saw that there were no more Europeans there. They certainly could be fine. They had with them a man from the New Netherlands that Peter had known very well, Peter Minuit had known very well, who could speak a dialect of Lenape. So they fired the cannon, and the Lenape came to see what was going on, and they explained that they were there to be friends and to share the land. And they gave the Lenape gifts, and then they asked them to sign contracts. And of course, the Swedes thought, oh, good, they're selling the land to us. The Lenape thought, oh, these are our friends. This just says that we're going to be friends and share everything together. One of the first misunderstandings between Europeans and Native Americans. But nevertheless, they were ready and they were started. And then tragedy goes. And that tragedy is because, let me show you the map. That might help a little bit. You can see the area which the Swedes were claiming. Wilmington as the beginning at Fort Christina, and then first up to the Susquehanna River. And then when a new governor came after Peter Minuit, it was pushed up, you can see on the map, beyond the Schuylkill River all the way to the falls of the Delaware at Trenton. And it was pushed down and finally on both sides of the Delaware River, so that it really involved Pennsylvania, Delaware, and to some extent later in New Jersey. New Jersey was suspect. Why? Because they thought it's a junky place, you know. Look at all that sand, those dumb little cedar trees, you know, and they're not going to plant anything there. So they didn't settle there. They settled on the west side at first. Eventually, you know, when they began to run out of land, that was a different story. The second, to say what happens to Peter Minuit. Peter Minuit goes back and makes this great report about how well everything turned out. And he left 20 soldiers there who constructed the fort. They were half Swedes and half Dutch. That's important because that was the first log cabin ever built in America. Log technology did not exist in England. There were no forests. You weren't allowed in the forest. They belonged to the nobility. There was no possibility of log things in a place like the Netherlands, where there was practically no forest at all. So anyway, the Dutch and the Swedish soldiers stayed there. Minuit decides that he will go down to St. Kitts. He's taking the long way back. And he has on board furs. And I think I have another picture of furs. Because one of the reasons to have the colony was the popularity of felt hats. And you need a lot of fur for felt. And for the Native Americans, the fur was not important. It wasn't a great value. So they were very happy to sell it or give it to the Swedes and trade it for very nominal things. So Peter Minuit has furs and he has wine, and he takes it to St. Kitts and he trades it for tobacco, because tobacco is worth more than the furs. And they're about ready to leave, and he has a friend of his. Oh, they're in another Dutch ship. Can't we go out and have a little like aquavit, a little, you know, something, a little pick-me-up, and tell about our adventures? So he went out with his friend in this other tall ship. A hurricane came up, blew the ship away, and nobody ever heard of Peter Minuit again. Terrible tragedy, because he was a brilliant person. And he knew everybody. I mean, he grew up in an area that was, it's now Germany, Wesel. There were a bunch of French Protestants living there who did not like the Roman Catholics in what is today Belgium and wanted to leave. He had plans to bring them to New Sweden. That all fell apart when Peter Minuit died. But the government looked at the whole situation and said, well, we can still do something about this. They found another governor, Peter Hollander Ritter. They sent him over to look at everything. And he came back with a glowing report and said, you could make a tremendous colony here, except you have a really stupid place for your capital. You know, if you're going to control the Delaware, you need to be out on the Delaware River. And he pointed out a couple different places, one of them being Tinicum Island, that you could have a much better situation. So Peter Hollander River goes back, and then a very interesting situation comes. There was, despite the fact of all the reports that had been written back and forth, not much understanding about America or the landscape or its worth as a colony. People were confused about it, so that England did the same thing. England and France and Sweden, they sent people who had committed petty crimes over there to be settlers, because people didn't want to go there. America is a terrible place. It's awful. You can be killed by the natives. You know, you won't get enough food. There's no schools. There's no churches. There's no hospitals. There's nobody. There's no education. Don't go. So anybody who had money and possession didn't go to America. But whenever they had someone who had killed a moose in the King's Forest in Sweden, rather than killing him, they sent him to New Sweden. They didn't believe in jails in those days. If you did something you didn't like, you were killed. That was it. Knowing that some of this sort of person were the characters there, they said, we need a really strong governor. We can't have anybody who just, fools around. Somebody's going to take charge. And at that point, Johann Prince enters the picture, a fascinating person, over 6 feet tall, weighing more than 400 pounds. He had been a soldier. He grew up in the parsonage of a Lutheran church in southern Sweden. He was going to become a pastor. And so he was studying in Germany at some of the German theological faculties to pick up the same position that his father had. But he got co-opted into the 30 Years' War, first actually fighting not for the Swedish side, but for the opposite side. Finally, he got pulled into the Swedish army. He got to be a lieutenant colonel. He was a very strong leader. He yelled and screamed, and everybody just said, yes, Johann, whatever you want, And when he entered the room, if he was 400 pounds and outspoken, he controlled everything. So they said, well, he will be perfect. But the problem was, he was in Sweden because of a mistake as a soldier. He was in charge of a German city called Chemnitz, fairly modest-sized city. And he sees over the hill the emperor's troops coming. And there are 5 times as many troops as he has holding the city. So he said, get out your bugle, retreat, we're getting out of here. So all the Swedes leave Chemnitz, and the emperor's troops take it over. Well, he should have gone back to his commanding officer to explain what had happened and why he had given up the city, but he didn't, because he thought the commanding officer obviously was not as smart as he was. Anyway, so he goes back to Stockholm, and when they hear that he's absent without leave and he never reported, they put him in the jail at the bottom of Stockholm Palace. And he had to sit there for a couple of weeks till he explained himself. So finally they realized that he really had a lot of ability and that it was just a tragic error on his part. And that actually he was the sort of personality they needed for New Sweden. He would take charge. He would fix everything for them. He had 4 daughters and he had a wife, his second wife, with him who would go. So they said, yeah, you just have to go for 3 years, and then you can come back. And guess what? We will give you a noble. Your grandmother actually was in a noble family, but since there wasn't a male heir, the nobility died out. So you can take that old prince name that your grandmother had and be a noble again, and your coat of arms will be in the House of Nobles, and you'll be a great guy after that. And so Johann Prince said, fine, I'll do it. He didn't have much choice, really. So off he went to Sweden, to New Sweden, and he certainly did a lot of work in a very short time. He moved the capital from Wilmington to Tinicum Island. There he built his own executive mansion, the Prinshof, with real windows and all sorts of things. And it was also the governmental center of New Sweden. So court cases were held there, and any other sort of business was in his own personal home. A church was built. Another fort was put there on Tinicum Island, New Gothenburg. And then he realized that he couldn't control the Delaware when he was at Tinicum. He needed to be further down the Delaware to find out who's coming up the river. So he established another fort, New Elfsborg, which was near the Varkens Kill, or today you call it the Salem River. And that was a very smart spot for a fort because the Delaware River's channel goes very close to New Jersey there. So if you're coming up from the south, you have to go along the Jersey coast. So here he had his fort with a cannon sticking out. If he didn't like you, he shot the cannon out and you had to stop and pay your taxes or explain why you were there. So he did that. He put another one on the Schuylkill River because he wanted to make sure that the Dutch were not going to get the furs first. Being at Fort Nassau in New Jersey, he would have a fort up on the Schuylkill to make sure that the Swedes would get them. So it seems as though things were going quite well. There were a couple more ships that came, and he wrote lots of reports back about what was going on, and he needed more people. He needed things to trade with the Lenape, because that was very important to keep them happy, and for them to know that they were still appreciated. And otherwise there would have been serious problems, which there wasn't. In the whole time of New Sweden, there were 5 Swedes who were killed and no Lenape. That's the only good relationship between Europeans and Native Americans on the East Coast. It's quite amazing. What happened in Massachusetts and Virginia is just incredible, the massacre of the Indians and the misunderstanding of the Indians. But there were a lot of reasons why the Swedes and the Finns got along with the Indians. The first was that there weren't very many of them. That made the Indians happy. They didn't feel like they were being pushed out, and they didn't keep coming as thousands kept coming to Virginia till you got 18,000 people living in Virginia because it kept coming and coming and coming. So they weren't threatened because of that. And the Swedes were people who were farmers who lived out in the woods. They weren't like the Quakers in Philadelphia, who were tradesmen, who were afraid to walk in the woods because they would get lost. The Swedes could go on hunts with the Native Americans and be with them for a couple of weeks. Wasn't a problem. So they had a lot of things that were similar. The other thing, of course, is the Swedes had their sauna and the Indians had their sweat lodge. So I suppose if they had a problem, they could go into the sauna and work that out. But for, among all these things that happened, it's interesting now when we see how very well that they really did get along. This is Uppsala Cathedral in Sweden. It's just north of Stockholm. And it was from here that originally the first Lutheran pastors came in the second voyage, I guess. The first Lutheran pastor came, and there were 4 or 5 of them who were there during New Sweden. One of whom, Johann Campanius, wrote the first book in the Algonquin language. It was Luther's Small Catechism in 2 versions. He called it the Virginia language. That was interesting because while we don't see that many of the Indians really converted, a few did, most didn't because their lifestyle was so different. It does show us that at least the clergy and many of the people who lived in New Sweden considered Native Americans to be people. That seems odd, doesn't it? But let's face it, in Europe, Carl Linnaeus did not have the Native Americans as Homo sapiens, and neither did a lot of other scientists in Europe. They thought they were like some sort of terrible or aborigines that weren't quite human. So the fact that the Lenape language was put into a book is significant because it tells us something about the relationship between them. Well, in 1655, it was all over because that's when the Dutch came. And there was a little uptick to that. Sweden got involved with another one of its wars. Beside the 30 Years' War, it has a lot of little wars going on. And it had one with Denmark, which was always their enemy for years because Denmark was a bigger country, it was a richer country, and it controlled the access to the Baltic. It had both sides of the Baltic. All the ships had to go through there. And the Danes took money from every ship that went through there. So there was always something going on with the Danes. So for 4 years, there was a battle with the Danes, And one of the tragedies was the admiral of the Swedish fleet was also the one in charge of the New Sweden Company in Sweden. So the great leader who had pushed for lots of things was killed because of the 4 years of war. Johann Prince's letters never got answered. So he would write and write and write, and he never got an answer. And he never knew even if the letters arrived. And he was getting desperate because if he doesn't have trade items for Lenape, they will become sour and problems will happen. So he really needs that. And he needs more people. And he keeps talking about this and talking about this. And they had a couple years of bad harvest. And finally, the people decided, well, it's all Prince's fault. We have to get rid of him. So there was a mutiny. And 22 of the people who were the farmers and the real movers and shakers in the colony signed a document of their problems with Prince, calling for his removal. Well, he was furious when he saw that. And he, first of all, he shot the guy who was the leader of it. And then he realized, well, I can't shoot everybody because these are the 22 most important people in the whole colony. So he went back to Sweden. He had served 10 years for a 3-year contract. And he thought, well, maybe I can, if I get there myself, they will listen. Well, he finally did get there, and they did listen. And there was one final push to keep the colony going. And they thought, well, let's get someone who's an expert on trade. So they found a fellow by Johan Riesing, who had just written a huge book on mercantilism. He invented the term for the Swedish intellectuals and talked about, how countries grow and how funds are put together and how stock exchanges work and all this kind of thing. So Johan Riesing comes over, and when he's ready to go from Gothenburg and the ship is ready to sail, so many people are there that 100 people get stopped on the docks. So they had more than 300 people on this ship. We should have only had 200. And the reason for that was that they had finally discovered, after all these years, a way to get people to leave Sweden. People didn't want to leave, as most people who were in the middle class or above in European colonies didn't want to leave and come to America. And it had to do with the Finns. There was a large number of Finns who had come over to settle in Sweden, who had a special type of agriculture, which we would call slash and burn. And they would build their house in the middle of an area. They would slash and burn, and then they would sow rye. The rye would grow this high because in those days you didn't have fertilizer. They just knew that this would work. And you'd do that for a couple of years. Then you'd have cattle growing. Then you'd burn this area, and you'd burn this area, and you'd burn that area. It took huge amounts of property to have that kind of agricultural. Interestingly, Native Americans also did slash and burn. So the Finns were being persecuted by the regular farmers who were there with their plows. And here are these other people burning down all the forests. Plus the copper industry was getting very strong, and copper industry wanted the forest to make charcoal. So because of that, Queen Christina writes out a thing against the forest Finns, prohibiting them from cutting down the forest. Of course, that would be the end of their lifestyle. And so they realized that they could go to America, they could chop down as much as they want. So finally, at the very end, they have the ship called the Eagle, which comes to New Sweden. 100 people die, unfortunately, on the way over, mostly of disease, but you have 200 new arrivals in the country. And at that point, the numbers of the colony were down to like 60 some. So you're going from 60 to 200 overnight. And there was, in fact, another group that came over later, Finns of another 100 or so. So people were finally beginning to see that it's worth going to this country. You can do something here. But unfortunately, the Dutch patience was wearing out, and there was a new governor in New Amsterdam, a person you probably know, Peg Leg Pete. Do you remember him? Peter Stuyvesant. He had lost a leg in Curacao. He was a military one. And if there was a doppelganger for Prince, it was Stuyvesant. It's amazing. Both military, both demanding, outspoken, yelling, screaming types who just demanded obedience, complete obedience in every way. His father was clergy in the Reformed Church in the Netherlands. So they're very interesting. Well, this is a problem because Peter Stuyvesant is not going to put up with these Swedes, ruining the fur trade and getting the tobacco first. No way he's going to do that. So he sends 120 soldiers down to Fort Nassau. And then he takes 11 ships. Can you imagine? I mean, all the voyages that came from Sweden to New Sweden, there were no more than maybe 12 ships altogether. 2 of them went off course and they were lost. But here on one day, 11 ships from New Amsterdam comes up. And the sailors are drumming and tooting on their trumpets and firing their cannons into the air and sailing up and down the Delaware River just to thumb their nose to Johann Prince. Well, he had a little yacht, and so he follows in his little yacht. Must have been funny, really, this 400-man guy, all these people doing this music circus in the Delaware River. And Prince realized, this is over, there isn't anything that I'm going to be able to do about this. That was one of the reasons that he went back, besides the mutiny. But anyway, sometime later, after he knew that Prince was not there, and I think he loved the fact that Prince had to go home on a Dutch ship from New Amsterdam. Oh boy, that was pleasant, I guess. He knew that he would be able to get away with things. So he came down in September 1655 and took over the whole colony. And there were hardly anything was shot. And that was the end of New Sweden in history as a government. And the conditions were rather favorable. I mean, the governor, Johan Riesing, and the soldiers were allowed to keep their muskets, and they could go back to Sweden if they wanted. They could go back on Dutch ships, and the farmers in the area could remain on their property. There was some looting that the Dutch did. They couldn't avoid that, of course, with so many ships. But for the Swedes, they were required to pledge allegiance to the States General in the Netherlands. So the new governor says, "Will you?" Of course. I'm in favor of anybody. I can stay on my farm. You can come get your bushel of wheat or whatever for the taxes. So most of the Swedes stayed. They didn't leave. And the next year, because Peter Stuyvesant was having lots of problems with the English in Connecticut who wanted to come over and take over New York. And actually the Dutch had settled Hartford before the English came there. So he had that problem to deal with. And he was sort of worried about that. So he realized, well, these people aren't too dangerous. They're really just farmers. And they can't be too awful because they're Protestants, almost as good as the Dutch Reformed, but not really. So he gave them their own independent government called the Swedish nation. So from 1656, after the surrender of New Sweden, up until 1664, when the British took over the area, the Swedes governed themselves. First from the Princehof, but then the prince's daughter sold the mansion So they couldn't meet there, so they moved across the water to Chester. And so the government for the Swedish nation, which was called the Upland Court, was held in Chester until 1664. And when the British came, they saw that there were so many Swedes around Chester and Upland and that area that William Penn decided, although he had thought of that as a place for Philadelphia, he would move up the river. And that's exactly, where he ended up being. Well, meanwhile, the Swedes are still speaking Swedish. After all this time, can you imagine, since 1655? They had a Lutheran church service. They taught their kids the catechism in English, or read the Bible, or sang the hymns for them in Swedish. And so in 1693, a member of this church, Holy Trinity Church in Wilmington, and they didn't have the building yet, writes to the king and said, we need to get more pastors because our two churches are falling apart without leadership. So the king agreed and sent 3 pastors over in 1697, 3 Swedish Lutheran pastors. And they first built the church in Wilmington, Holy Trinity, and then the same contractors went to Philadelphia and built Gloria Dei Church. The third priest who was there was given a job to deal with the Indians, especially the Susquehannocks and the Minquas. So he went out into that territory, and then he ended up settling in Elkton, Maryland, where he founded a congregation, St. Mary Ann's Church. And the interesting thing about that is that that churchyard has a number of Lenape graves, and that's unusual. Lenape did not want their people to be buried in a Christian churchyard unless they had been baptized. So that it shows us that maybe a few actually did join, and that maybe Johannes Campanius's catechism wasn't in naught for all. It may have actually been used to some extent. And then here is Gloria Dei in Philadelphia, a different looking church, but exactly the same size inside. It's now the oldest church building in Pennsylvania, and the only building still extant in which Wiliam Penn was known to have walked. Oh, here's our 2 Indian friends, Tishkohan and Lapowinska. If you go to the Philadelphia Museum of Art into the American section, you'll see the original of these 2 paintings right in the beginning. And they're interesting paintings in many ways. They were painted by a Swedish painter, Gustavus Hazelius. Both his 2 brothers were Lutheran pastors at the church in Wilmington, one after the other. He came over, spent his whole life here as a painter, especially as a portrait painter. He was very interested in the Indians and in the way they could make colors and paints. And so the Penn sons, when they were going to do the walking purchase, that terrible, deceitful thing, asked if he would paint 2 of the elders. So he did, Tishkohan and Lapowinska. These are the first pictures of Native Americans that are authentic and respectful. They don't make them look like cartoons or animals. So it really is an important thing to remember. It's that relationship with the Indians and the Swedes and the Finns was such a positive one. Well, here's that catechism I was talking to you about. There is a original one in the Swedish Museum in Philadelphia, down near the Sports Center. We have a copy in the Swedish Colonial Society Museum at Tinicum. And over in the right, I'd like to make this bigger. I can't make it any bigger, but anyway, the picture is there. It's from Thomas Campanius Holmes, a book about America. He had never been in America, but he needed pictures. And so he went to his local Dutch bookseller and picked out all these pictures of Indians, because he thought, I have to sell this work because this is a description of America. Well, it wasn't a very good description of America. And the description of the Indians is even worse. It really is terrible, because in the back, you see that there is a funeral going on, and it is a European funeral, putting a body in the ground. Lenape didn't do that. The body was propped up in the forest. You see that there's a battle going on here. All people are lined up like European soldiers. Indian didn't fight that way. That's how little understanding there was of Native Americans and how to portray them. They're considered some sort of odd or weird person. Here's the log cabins. One of the ones, maybe you've seen this, in Drexel Hill, the Lower Swedish log cabin. One of the oldest, probably the late 17th century. There's nothing left from the actual New Sweden time at all. That's all disappeared. But this is one of the very oldest ones, and luckily it's still around. There's a group of people who take care of it, the Friends of the Lower Swedish log cabin. Now, while the Lutheran pastors were trying to keep their churches going and trying to keep them speaking Swedish, eventually they had to speak English. It was just inevitable. So here on the right is Israel Crelius. He was a very well-known dean of the Lutheran pastors in Wilmington. He goes home to Sweden. He writes a history of New Sweden, a very good history. It's the first one that we have. And on the left, you have a picture of St. David's Episcopal Church outside of Philadelphia. It's a Welsh church. And the reason that that's there is the Lutherans and the Episcopalians became best buddies in America. There was no bishop in the Episcopal Church till after the Revolution. But they believed, like the Lutherans, in a sacramental view. They believed in educating their children, and so they cooperated all the time together, so that when St. David's Episcopal Church was dedicated in 1711, one of the persons dedicating it, they had a pastor at each corner, was the Swedish pastor from Glory Day Church in Philadelphia. And so the Swedes were considered to be the brothers of the Anglican clergy. And Anglican clergy also were very rare in America. People started churches, but they had no ministers. And so the Swedish clergy often preached, sometimes for 30 or 40 years. They never had an Englishman because the Englishmen weren't there. A good example is the church in Salem, St. John's Episcopal in Salem. They had Swedish pastors forever till they could finally get an English one. Well, to continue the story of St. David's Episcopal Church, now the largest Episcopal church in southeastern Pennsylvania, but a small Welsh congregation for many years. Like most Episcopal churches, it closed during the Revolution because the clergy had taken an oath at their ordination to support the king. And they were caught in the middle of this revolution. So most of them just closed the churches. They didn't have services, waited till the revolution was over. And there was a new Book of Common Prayer that had the king's name taken out. And so they got things together again. Well, the same thing happened at St. David's Church. The church was closed, and we don't have a picture of Slater Clay as an adult, but when he got to be an adult, he married a Swedish woman, a Swedish descendant, from Christ Church Upper Marion, because not only was he at St. David's, but he would go to Upper Marion, he would go to Perkiomen, and he went to various different churches. And so he married this woman who was 100% Swedish. Now their son was Jehu Curtis Clay. And Jehu Curtis Clay was the first clergy who was not from the Church of Sweden at Glory Day Church in Philadelphia. So you could see how these people were all connected. Here he comes as the pastor of the Lutheran Church. and he's an Episcopalian. But for the people in the pew, there was no change. It was the easiest change imaginable. They all used the Book of Common Prayer. They never translated the Swedish hymns or the Swedish liturgy. They always used the Episcopal things. There was no confirmation because there's no bishops. And in Sweden, confirmation had not been yet established. So these churches worked together and all survived together. And of course, this is the status church in Philadelphia, of course. Christ Church with its phenomenal, bells and tower where so many members of Congress, were. Now, this is an interesting picture. It's both good and bad. It's on the ceiling of the Swedish Museum in Philadelphia. Swedish Museum is on Patterson Avenue in FDR Park. It was put together in 1926. The building was built in 1926. It opened in 1938. And when it opened, it had this mural on the top called The Coming of the Swedes. And we don't know if that's Peter Minuit there or not, because there is no picture of Peter Minuit. In fact, in the village that he's from in Germany, in Wessel, they have a sculpture that's free form, for him, because they don't know what he looked like. So we're not sure if that's him or not, but there are some Indians who look a little suspicious, maybe a little bit like Sioux rather than the Lenape, who didn't have so many feathers and such. And there is a Lutheran pastor in the black standing in the back. The worst part is up at the top, which you can't see. It says the coming of civilization to the Delaware Valley. Well, you could say that in 1926. We wouldn't say that today. Today we would say the coming of European civilization, because we have a different attitude towards people who are different than us. If you go to Tinicum, to the town of Essington, in Governor Prince Park, which is the location of his original Princehof executive mansion, you will see not only a statue of him, but a Swedish colonial log village. This was just put together 2 years ago by the Swedish Colonial Society, and it's open the first Saturday of every month from 12 to 2, and if there's any events going on, it's open then. The village was actually created by Swedish carpenters in 1988 and was erected in Bridgeton, New Jersey, of all places, and had to do with a lot of log rolling and taxes for the state of New Jersey. But since there were no Swedes in Bridgeton, it was ignored. And so the Swedish Colonial Society rescued it, moved it, put it back together with only 2 logs that had gone astray, amazingly, after all that time. But it's there to remind people of the log cabins. And a couple blocks away, just north of Prince Park in Tinicum, is the Lazaretto. This is a quarantine station that the city of Philadelphia built in 1799. You might remember the stories of the yellow fever and the terrible things that were going on. After that, the city fathers decided we have to have a quarantine station. It can't be near the city. It has to be way down on the Delaware. And Tinicum is a perfect place because it's far enough away. So they built this entire facility, and it was the quarantine station for about 100 years. Then it had a diverse history as an athletic club and a place where seaplanes were landing in the First World War, and then was kind of forgotten. And Tinicum Township decided that it was such an important building that it needs to be kept. So that they launched a big project for $12 million and fixed it up. At one point, the airport wanted the space for parking. And the town fathers at Tinicum Township said, never, it's not going to become parking. We're going to restore it. And what they did, which was quite unusual, is the whole left side of the building that you see there, that's the west side, that is part of the Tinicum Township headquarters. That was a funding mechanism. They could get money from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for a township headquarters, so that helped. The right-hand side, which is the eastern side, is given over to nonprofit organizations. So the first floor is a museum and an event space dealing with the Lazaretto and the work that they did for over 100 years. The second floor has 3 museums. The first one is Tinicum Historical Society, which tells the whole history of Tinicum, a lot of things about the Indians, which is one of the reasons why, of course, Prince wanted to have his capital there, because the Indians were already there. And the second one is the Swedish Colonial Society Museum. That's the one that Ruth and I have been working on, just opened this spring. And the last one is to do with Italian immigration to the Delaware Valley. So you have 3 very interesting and unusual museums in one place. So if you want to know more about New Sweden, I suggest you can go to Tinicum and find out. Questions?
You mentioned the 3 ministers that were sent by the king.
Right.
What precisely was the relationship between Crown and the church at that point?
Very close. The king was considered the defender of the church. You were, as it was in England and in France and Italy, you were required to be a member of the national church. You were required to worship on Sundays. As parents, you were required to teach your children Luther's small catechism. So there were a lot of legal requirements. If you didn't show up on Sunday for worship, you would be fined. The town government and the church government in any area was only one. It was the parish system, the same as in Louisiana. They kept that going by calling it a parish, but it really was that way in Sweden. The local pastor of the church there was really the mayor of the town also. And the church council was the town council. That was true until the 1860s. And then that, the government functions then were separated from the church. So it was a very strong connection, and the king had the money. And even so, the king did, ask for advice from the archbishop. And that's the way he got the candidates, those first 3 candidates. Who should we get? And the person then who began taking over a lot of the oversight wasn't the king, but it was the person who helped with selecting the first 3 candidates, a fellow who then became the bishop of the city of Skara. And he listed himself as Jesper Svedberg, Bishop of Skara, London, and America, because he had founded a Swedish church in London, which still exists. But he took very good care of those Swedish churches, wrote to them all the time, and until 1735 and his death, he then was in charge of getting the candidates, which he got excellent people. They were really lucky, and they kept going with the Swedish culture and language as long as they could, maybe a little longer than they should have, but they certainly preserved all those congregations. They began with 2. At the end, there were 8 that they had established. So there really aren't 2 old Swedish churches. There's 8.
So as a colonial project, this colony lasted a couple decades, was pretty small scale. Did Sweden have any larger, more successful colonial projects?
It had other projects. It had one in Africa at the same time at Cabo Corso. And they made out a little better there. That was on the Gold Coast, because there was a need for copper. so they could bring the Sweden had almost a monopoly on copper for many years. So they could bring their copper goods to Africa and trade that. So that lasted actually longer than New Sweden. But eventually the Dutch took it over too, because the Dutch were also on the same area on the Gold Coast. Everybody was, the Danes were there, the Dutch were there, the Swedes were there, all trying to put in an ore, so to speak. So there was that Cabo Corso one. And then there was one final one in the 1780s. Gustavus III, the King of Sweden, wanted a colony in the Caribbean. And he thought he could make a lot of money with one. So he talked to the King of France, who was another, dictator like he was, and made a deal with him that you can bring your ships to Gothenburg for free, and we won't charge you anything if you give us an island. So they got St. Bartholomew, St. Bart's, became a Swedish colony. It was a colony for 100 years. And its capital city was called Gustavia, still called Gustavia, after the kings of Sweden. And so there was some Swedish immigration there, but very little. Most of the immigrants there spoke French. And it never really made money. And of course, they got rid of it just when they should have kept it as a Caribbean, hideaway, where they could have made a fortune. But, I think they were thinking of doing more slave trading. The Danes did a lot more than the Swedes. The Danes had a colony in India that worked out very well, and they had the Virgin Islands. And, the Virgin Islands, especially St. Thomas, was maybe the biggest slave trading place in the Caribbean. So the Danes made a lot of money from the Caribbean. But the Swedes at St. Bart's, it was way off in the corner, and they didn't make so much. So they tried, but they didn't make it.
Yeah, I'm originally from that area that's right near Old Swedes Church. And I've always been curious about the coexistence of the Swedes and the British when the British came. Did they continue to coexist peacefully once Penn took over?
Yeah, Penn actually liked the Swedes.
Okay.
In fact, he has some very good things to say about them. And he used the Swedes to be translators with the Native Americans because they could all speak 3 or 4 dialects. And in fact, the 3 pastors who came over at the end of the 1600s visited Penn before he came to the United States. So they knew him well, and he supported them. In fact, he gave them a Bible that they still have.
And I know that a lot of, when they were building I-95, they destroyed a lot of, so is any of that from before Penn's time?
I don't think so.
No.
There was an old house of Sven Svensson's house, but that was across Christian Street, but I think it was pulled down in the 1890s. That's the one they should have kept because it was a wooden house and it was very old. Right now, the Gloria Dei Church is working on restoring that whole area that's beyond the cemetery as a woodland. And the idea is that everything planted there is going to be native to Pennsylvania that could have been growing before Penn and the Swedes came there. They're calling it Sven's Woods. So that whole area that's beyond the cemetery, we hope in a couple years will be a beautiful forested area.
One more. Is that the original building of Old Swedes, or was there something there before that?
There was a wooden building there before. 1677, there was a blockhouse church built there. And I mean, this is another one of the silly things, Lars Locke, who was the last of the Swedish pastors from the colony who lived forever, it seems, was able to get 2 churches built by the English government because there's no such thing as, passing the hat to build a church. Churches were built by the governments. So Larslock convinced people that they would build a church in Delaware, in an area called Crane Hook, and then 10 years later, build another one at Vicaco, which is the location where Gloria Dei Church was. It's somewhat ironic to think that he sold this to the English government by saying, we need a place to worship, but if the Indians get bad, you can use it as a fort. Well, nobody had better friends with the Indians than the Swedes, so they certainly didn't need a fort, but that was a convincing argument to get the money out of the British government. British government was very favorable towards the Lutheran Church. And so they were willing to do that kind of thing. The Dutch were not. So they had a little difficult time when the Dutch were there.
And was Old Swedes always Episcopal?
It was Lutheran until 1835. Then it joined the diocese. As I said, the people in the pew didn't notice any difference. They'd used all the Episcopal Church stuff for so long, it didn't seem to be any different. And it wasn't. In effect, most of the Swedish pastors worked so much in Episcopal churches that didn't have ministers that when they went back to Sweden, they always stopped in London and said hello to the Bishop of London, who was in charge of the American churches at a distance, of course. And the Bishop of London would always give them a pension. So all the Swedish pastors who had been here, they went back to Sweden and they were still using, enjoying the fruits of their work with the Episcopal Church. I mean, it's taken us, churches in the United States until the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, to understand how much we have in common and how we ought to be doing things together and not competing with each other. But the Swedes and the Episcopalians knew that from the very beginning.
Well, thank you very much. We're delighted that you could come enlighten us on New Sweden tonight. And let me close with a reminder to everybody who's watching that if you don't know about Archives Month, you really owe it to yourself to check out the website, archivesmonthphilly.com, not org, com.com. And see what's going on for the rest of the month at all those other wonderful places that are putting on the best shows they can to try to draw folks in. And with that, good night, and thank you for listening.